Well, my name is Margarita Mooney Clayton. I am a professor at the Princeton Theological Seminary, where I teach in the Department of Practical Theology. I'm also the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation, which aims to restore American culture through liberal arts education, beauty, and religion. I am honored today to have with us Aidan Hart. I had the pleasure of meeting Aidan this past summer in the United Kingdom when I was there with my husband, David, who's also with us today. And I had spent all summer hearing David rave about this guy, Aidan Hart, and his most recent book called On Festal Icons, which maybe we'll get to. And then after I got back from the UK, I was so intrigued with Aidan that I invited him to be a speaker at Scala's Spring Conference, which I'll tell you about. And I read his book, Beauty, Spirit, and Matter. And all I did for weeks was walk around the house quoting Aidan Hart to my husband, David. And so thank you for providing us with many interesting dinner conversation topics, Aidan. But what I really want to share with you today is to let Aidan talk a little bit about his story, why the renewal of liturgical art is so important to culture, not only the culture within our spaces of worship, but to culture more broadly. Scala's mission is to try to bring together people who create beautiful culture like Aidan, but who understand that the renewal of culture in our places of worship spreads out to the larger culture. But how does that happen? Why is that so important? And so Aidan will be speaking this coming April at our Scala Spring Conference on Art, the Sacred, and the Common Good. Everybody who's here today will get an email asking you to register if you'd like. We've just finished the creation of the website. Registration is going to be going live soon, but I'll say more about that later. But we're also delighted to be able to offer those of you who are here today a discount if you register before we send out the general registration information. And at our conference, Aidan's going to speak on liturgical art as prophecy and priesthood, sacred art, and the restoration of human dignity. At the event, you'll have the opportunity to meet with Aidan in a breakout session. Also, the artist Jonathan Pajot will be in attendance, the writer Andy Crouch, two women, Annika Prather and Angel Parham Adams, who've written on the classical tradition in African-American communities and the importance of beauty and lament in the African-American experience. We'll have Paul Courier from the Common Sense Society, R.J. Snell from the Witherspoon Institute. I could go on. But we are going to have sacred music at the conference, and we'll have educators who are implementing this vision in K-12 education. So now that I see most people have joined us, once again, I'll say you're welcome to introduce yourself on the chat box, and I will just repeat a little bit about who Aidan Hart is. Native of New Zealand, currently lives in England, spent time as a monk at Mount Athos in Greece. And he has been a liturgical artist for a number of years with commissions all over the world, and I think tens of thousands of them. And he's been an author. He's been someone who not only makes art, but tries to spread this mission through his writing. So his book, Festal Icons, History and Meaning, came out in 2002. And his book, Beauty, Spirit, and Matter, is a collection of essays that was released in 2014. So welcome, Aidan. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Margarita. Welcome, everyone. The wonders of modern technology. We can share time together.
Yes.
Yes. Well, liturgical art. It struck me recently in the last few months that our connection is a little bit faulty. There's a bit of a time delay.
All right, that's okay. I think we can hear you all right, Aidan.
Good. Excellent. Yeah, so Margarita would like me to talk a bit about liturgical art. And just before we came on air, we were saying how it has struck me recently that our actions follow our vision. So if our actions are faulty, then generally I look to our vision, the way that we see the ideal life is wrong. So for example, our modern ecological crisis basically arises out of a wrong vision of the world, a vision where we think we'll be happy when we have lots of goods, for example. So liturgical art, I think, is so vital, not just for rich life of worship, because God gave us 5 senses. So for me, worshiping God isn't just singing or praying with our mouth. It's to smell God through the incense. It's to behold God in the icons. It's to taste God through communion and so forth. So that's the primary aim of liturgical art, to worship God with a whole being. It has a profound effect on how I will act outside the liturgy. When the service is finished and I go outside, if I've experienced a vision of the world where matter is a means of God coming to me and me expressing my love for God, then I will treat trees and animals differently, because I won't just see them as objects. I'll see them as a revelation of God's love for me. So for me, liturgical art's really vital to get it right, not only because it allows a fulsome worship, but also to orientate my whole life outside the liturgy. So if we want to solve the world's problems, start with, how do people see the world? What's their utopia? Of course, the word utopia means a place that doesn't exist. Utopus means it doesn't exist. So probably wrong action as a result of having an ideal which actually is unattainable, or if you do attain it, it won't actually satisfy you. So for me, getting liturgical art right is just so important for 101 reasons.
You know, and Aidan, maybe this would be kind of a start-off question that I was asking you, like, who disagrees with you on that, right? Why is it that you needed to write a book to make this argument, or several books? So when I hear you talk about that, and what I got so excited in reading your book was that I teach classes on philosophy of the social science, and we talk about different understandings of the human person. And on the one hand, we talk about this debate as the highest level of human development being this contemplative state where somehow matter doesn't matter anymore. We sort of rise above matter and we sort of float spiritually, contemplatively. Then there's this other view of the human person where no, we're sensory beings, we're embodied beings, and we're constantly responding, reacting to our environment around us in a way that's almost kind of deterministic, like matter determines us, right? And then how does that play out in artistic movements or in claims about what the incarnation means, right? So what I found so fascinating in reading your book was that people who believe in the Christian view of the human person need to resist this mind-body or spirit-body dualism. And I think one of the ways that dualism plays out in sort of contemporary problems is a kind of disembodied cognitive, that all we are is our kind of rational thinking, and we can direct our body to do anything we want. We can create our body. It doesn't really matter what's been given to us in creation. We can just use our direction. Or the opposite, that we can't do that at all. So we're sort of nihilistic, right? That who we are, who we're created to be with all of our flaws, including our fallenness and our brokenness, that is who we are. And our bodies are telling us the world is really a dark, dark place. So who disagrees with you that liturgical art should be beautiful and inspiring us to God and to a unified view of the person?
I was commissioned by a priest recently to design a wall painting for the apse. It's a Catholic church not far from here. Most of the congregation wanted it, but some preferred white walls. So the priest asked me to give a talk to this group. So about 40 of the parishioners turned up. And I spoke about the theology of the image, that because God has become flesh, we can depict Christ, who's God become man. But also I talked about how entrance into the church isn't just me and my God, but it's the Lord plus all my brothers and sisters and the angels and the seraphim. It's communal. And then there were questions. Just in general, but also about this design. And some people said, oh, I much prefer a white wall. You know, I don't want anything getting in the way of my relationship with God. So I was a bit taken aback. I mean, I was half prepared, but basically there was many opinions about liturgical art as there were people. And I was a bit shocked, really, that, and these were older people, mainly 60 years old, churchgoers most of their life. And I thought, goodness, you know, we're almost back to scratch here, sort of almost iconoclastic view that So I think there's a lot of work to be done still, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done still. Perhaps it's, I don't know what, but the young people, interestingly, wanted liturgical art, they saw the role of liturgical art. So it seems obvious that beauty is important, but I've actually found when it comes down to it, a lot of people are a bit afraid of change. If they're used to a white wall with a little cross on it, they're just afraid of change. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done there. But I think one step back, I think this element of the human person called the nous, the old word for it in Latin is intellectus. This has been lost sight of. In the secular world says we're a body with a brain, that's it, you were talking about that earlier. Or you get the reaction to that, saying, oh no, we're spirits and the body is just a discardable shell. Both of those are anthropological heresies, I call them, the two extremes. But the nous is the eye of the heart, that which can know God and people in a direct way. But that nous isn't just a sort of a spirit rattling around in a body, that God created us a union of spirit and flesh. So we can't know God without the body, we can't know God without a spirit. So I think we really need to know our anthropology before we can know God. And I think one of the things that secularism has done is to sort of created a heresy about what the human person is. And so liturgical art isn't just about having beautiful things. It actually tells us a lot about what it is to be fully human, which is to be embodied, but to be spiritual beings who can know God through the material world, know God through prayer. So we need to tease this out a bit more. But really, liturgical art is like a focus about what it is to be a human person. So it's not as straightforward as we would have thought. We would have thought, yeah, beauty is important. But then we need to say, well, what sort of beauty? There's a sentimental beauty. There's a beauty that says, look at me. There's a beauty that says, look through me to the source of beauty. So I think this is where we need to refine what we mean by beauty.
Okay, great bridge question there, because what you said was so important. One, that what's been lost so much in the modern world is essentially this view of the human person as an integrated whole before we become parts, right? There's a tendency, a kind of a scientific reductionism. Let's just talk about the brain, or let's just talk about the body. No. The Christian understanding of the person is that we are a unity. Yes, we have parts, but those parts flow out of the unity. And what we do with those parts comes back to the nous. So this is why this matters. But then once we establish that it matters, and this is my second question that I thought was, I never heard this until I read your work. Well, we need to talk about what kind of beauty matters. And I think a lot of people are willing to grant that beauty matters, but they don't necessarily see a connection between church tradition, or dare we say dogma or doctrine, and images. Once you grant that beauty matters, let's just get images back, right? Let's just have images. But what your books are arguing is that just as there is a tradition or a dogma about which books go in scripture and how to translate scripture, if you want to bring appropriate liturgical art back into churches, you need to know the tradition of that art and how that art is understood to be an expression of dogma, because you say beautifully that dogma is the opposite of heresy. Dogma opens our minds and heresy closes our minds. So good art is in the service of dogma because it's an opening. It's that window that you just said, rather than a closing of who we are. Did I summarize your work well by saying that?
Really well. Yeah, and I think good. Let's just talk more specifically about iconography, the painted image. It has two roles really related to what you say. One is it presents us with the face of Christ, presents us with the person of the saints, the person of the angels. So in a sense, that is independent of how well it's painted. Like when I pray in front of an icon of Christ, I'm praying to Christ, I'm not praying to the image. The second role is how that saint, how Christ is painted, can have a direct effect on my soul. So we could sing the Psalms using rock music, or we could sing the Psalms using Gregorian music, same words, but a different form or style, if you like. So I think what needs to be refined a lot more in the West is how we depict the saints, how we depict Christ. So we have this word in Greek, amorlipi, which means, it's two words combined into one, a bright sadness or a joyful sadness. So with all the saints, we have a joy, of course, because they're full of joy, but also there's a slight sadness because even though they're in heaven, in the joy of the Lord, their compassion means that they're co-suffering with us. They're not separate from us. They're with us in our struggles. If it was all sweet and smiles, I mean, if I was going through a hardship, I wouldn't want to pray in front of an icon of the Mother of God, which has got a cheesy smile saying, cheer up, it'll be all right. I want to feel that she's with me. Also, a good icon will show marks of the steps needed to get to that holiness. So asceticism is needed, struggle is needed. So the icon depicts not just the end, but also the means. St. John the Baptist, for example, should have a nobility about his face, but also marks of that struggle, so that the icon just doesn't give us the sweet end, but also shows us to get there, needs to climb a mountain. I was at Mount Sinai last week, visiting St. Catherine's Monastery. So to get to the top of Mount Sinai, it's a 3-hour hard slog. And Moses met God at the top of the mountain, but he had to get there. There was a struggle. Literally, all of the theophanies in the Old Testament happen on the top of mountains. Now, God wasn't any closer at the top of the mountain than at the bottom, but to get to the top of the mountain, you can't take a lot of baggage with you. I couldn't take all my household goods with me to the top of Sinai. I had to strip off to the basics. So there was a struggle to get to that point where I'm open to God. So I think good liturgical art should show the means as well as the end. And it's a very difficult thing to do. I can't do that in my limited 40 years as an iconographer. I've got to start where 2,000 years the tradition have left off, like a good scientist doesn't just sort of start from scratch. A good scientist studies all the knowledge that's gone before and then adds their little bit. So I think a lot of humility is needed to make liturgical art. You need to start with the wisdom that's accrued over 2,000 years. Not that the tradition is just copying mindlessly. Like beloved David, your husband, I've worked with him and helped him to study. So I always say, well, start with what has been done in the past and gradually find your own voice. So this is an authentic David Clayton icon, but he's standing on the shoulders of what's gone before.
Look, 2 examples. I'm pretty new to teaching this, but I'm grateful that Princeton Theological Seminary has allowed me to develop classes where I now put sort of theological texts along with art and begin discussions with students about that. And perhaps the 2 most central images, you mentioned the martyrs and the saints, but, working in a Protestant context, I would love to hear your reflections on how you talk about art with Protestants, given your own background, I believe, as a Baptist, and your deep appreciation for scripture and your understanding of revelation and the word of God. But I will say, in my classes, it's been important to cover the church fathers on why we need to depict Jesus as a person, as a human being. But also, Aidan, I taught an entire class on the Virgin Mary. And as part of that class, I had a local artist here named Joanna Belcha, who'll be at the conference. And she gave several talks on prototypes of Marian art. And for me, it really unlocked the idea first of Christ as being fully human and fully divine is being depicted in early art, even before the doctrine was written down or defined, right? And also that the understanding of Mary as the mother of God, which became a central doctrine for all of Christians, was being worked out. And that art was a big way of describing dogmatically, theologically, who Mary is and why her role in salvation is so important. So I guess, that was a lot packed into one, but could you reflect a little bit on liturgical art and why it matters to the fullness of Christianity, including Protestantism, which oftentimes doesn't have a lot of images in scripture, and also about kind of art and tradition, like the specific tradition, let's say, of Marian art and the relationship between Marian dogma and images of Mary, the mother of God, or other images of Mary.
Yes, in the East, there was this period called iconoclasm, where a lot of people opposed images. So the church had to sort of think hard about whether or not images are good and why. And it wasn't just a matter of taste. It wasn't genuinely a matter of saying, oh, it's nice to have beautiful things. was always profoundly theological. So the main defense of having icons was, first of all, the incarnation, that God has become flesh, God has become visible. So to say we can't have images of Christ is to deny the incarnation, the Father said. So now that God has become visible, to have icons of Christ affirms that this is a reality. Why images of the Mother of God? The incarnation was possible because of the Virgin Mary. I love that verse in Hebrews where it says that we have come to the heavenly Jerusalem, we've come to the spirits of the righteous made just, we've come to the host of angels, and we've come to Christ. So it's interesting that we've come to Christ was at the end of this long list of basically all the brothers and sisters and the sons and daughters of the Father. So we can't come to Christ as individuals. We come to Christ as persons, and we come to Christ with all those who are with him. So that's why you have icons of the saints as well. We're baptized into the church, aren't we? I can't baptize myself. Another bishop, another priest baptizes me because I'm baptized into the community. So we have icons of Christ because he's God become flesh. We have icons of the Mother of God and the saints to show that I'm a member of the body of Christ. I'm not a member of a club with me and Jesus. You know, this club has a few million people in it. I can't have Christ without the brethren. So, and secondly, I think, and I've experienced this myself, that as an Anglican, I loved those words in the Apostolic Creed that says, I believe in the communion of the saints. And I used to think, well, I really like that idea, but I've got no idea of how it can be reality. The communion of the saints to me was an idea, but when I encountered orthodoxy in the icons and prayed in churches where I was surrounded by icons and surrounded by fresco, then it became reality. I suddenly realized that when I go to a church, the service might start at 10:30 in the morning, I realized, in fact, I'm not starting the service. I'm just joining in a ceaseless worship in heaven, that I'm participating in something that's ongoing. That only really became a reality to me through the images all around. As you said, for a while I was a monastic, and the hermitage which I founded was completely frescoed. So when I went in to pray in the morning, I realized I wasn't starting prayer. I was just participating in prayer before the angels and the saints around. Yeah, the fathers really approached imagery from a theological point of view rather than just private taste. To deny the icons of Christ was to deny the reality of the incarnation.
And then, so look, I'm going to move to some audience questions in a minute, but I think I also really want to hear you express. We just talked about the very early church and some of the heresies. Could you say a little bit more about the modern heresies around beauty and art? And in particular, again, one of the points I have with my students is that it's pretty difficult for people who've not studied a lot of beauty or thought about a lot, or maybe even for people who have, to suddenly go from beauty is important to there's some kind of tradition in beauty that's authoritative. Most people just want to say, no, it's just self-expression, or people have different tastes, or, and I say, listen, if you take nothing else away from my class, I said this about a week or two ago, I want you to know that there have been artistic movements in the 20th century, like surrealism, that essentially deny the unity of mind, body, and spirit, and portray reality as nothing other than a kind of stream of consciousness, imagination, dream state. And it's really dark. And it's a dark view of the human person. So are we living in a time of a heresy about the human person that's nihilism, that's the denial of meaning and purpose and goodness that's actually being expressed in what's so-called art?
Certainly. The word person, both in the Greek and the Latin, means face, and a face is fulfilled in relationship. So I can see everyone here because I have eyes, and soon I'll hear you. So face is fulfilled in relationship, a person is fulfilled in relationship. Whereas probably the key heresy of modernism is I'm Aidan Hart because I'm not you. I define myself in opposition to you. Whereas as a Christian person, I'm fulfilled in relationship with you. So love is central to being a person. So it's interesting, therefore, that the word art means to fitly join together. It comes from the Latin word ars arte. It's like articulated truck is two bits joined together. An articulate person joins words together. So art in its fullest sense joins me with other people. It joins me ultimately with heaven and with the invisible realities of the world. Like I love the image of the burning bush. Moses sees a bush that's burning without being consumed. So art should show the world not just as opaque matter, but as a revelation of God's glory. So art should join together the visible and the invisible. That explains in part the style of the icon. You're depicting the world as a burning bush, not just as a bush. You're indicating the presence of God's glory within. So true art joins me with the source of beauty. A false art is opaque and says, look at me, you know, I'm a beautiful painter, I'm a beautiful sculpture. But true art says, I am beautiful, but my beauty comes from beauty himself. So there's always, if you like, an imperfection built into liturgical art. That's one reason why traditional art, liturgical art, it has a certain flatness to it. It says, I'm not reality, I'm a reflection of reality. I'm real in that I'm paint on marble, whatever, but go through me to beauty himself. So I would say there's 2 or 3 key heresies, if you like, in modernism. One is that we become ourselves in opposition to others. Secondly, that originality is novelty. That true originality is going to the source of things, to the origin of things. So true originality is sourced in God himself. God is infinite and I'm finite, so I'm going to do things a little bit different from David. David will emphasize the red spectrum perhaps in the color spectrum, whereas I will emphasize the green aspect, but we're talking about the same light, and God is infinite and each person's going to reflect a slightly different element, but we're always going back to the origin. And the third is that humility is weak. I think so. We get this fascination with novelty. The search for novelty ends up punching people in the nose. You know what I mean? If you do something really radical and different, you sort of wake people up by punching them in the nose, shocking them. So hence Robert Hughes's book, The Shock of the New, basically summarizing modern art. I don't want to put more of modern art in sort of one heading, because there's some really great modern art. But it's not liturgical, but it has the numinous in it. It's a tendency in a lot of modern art to try to become well known by shocking, whereas there's a humility and enduring beauty. I'm a great fan of Constantine Brancusi's work. He was the father, if you like, of modern abstract sculpture, and he was a really humble man. You know, he was always saying that he's always trying to reveal the essence of things. You know, his work was always trying to reveal the inner fire, if you like, of things, not just the bush, but the bush alight with God's glory.
Thank you, Aidan. I am going to move us to open up to some questions from the audience, but let me just say that I think in order to continue this conversation, one, I have taken a lot of notes from your book and I just couldn't help it. I put something in the chat box that you also expressed beautifully right now when you were speaking, right? That there are timeless principles of original art, that what makes, of liturgical art, that liturgical art has to go back to the origins, to the beginning. It's not about, creation ex nihilo. Only God does that, right? So you've talked about the incarnation, that's why we have liturgical art. You've mentioned, or you actually haven't mentioned, the transfiguration, but it figures quite a lot in your writing. But you've also said so beautifully that matter is grace-bearing. So yes, we are bodies, but that deep inside of us, we are capable of being sanctified. You also talk about that we're communal, right? That we are fulfilled in relationship. And that we have this eye of the heart, right? You use this word nous. This is a new word to me, to be honest, but for my listeners, maybe take away this eye of the heart, that we have this place inside of us. We have this place in us where we don't just know about God, that we know God. We come to know God. So those are some of the principles of liturgical art, all of which I think can be thought of, if they're dogma or principles or doctrine, they're all responses to heresies, right? There are people who deny the incarnation. There are people who deny that matter can be sanctified. There are people who deny that we can know God, or that we can have relationships with others that aren't fundamentally competitive, that are about love, as you said, right? So these timeless principles, I see you as writing out these timeless principles to help share with other people why, not just how to make liturgical art, which I'm happy to hear you talk about, but why making good liturgical art is actually a really good way to respond to modern heresies. So with that, I will probably keep popping notes from your book into the chat box because I can't help myself. I'm a professor. I get excited about these ideas, if you can't tell, and I read things closely and I take notes, and I have the joy of sharing it with my students. But the purpose of this call was to bring together people who are engaged with Scala in some way, who are liturgical artists themselves, teachers, people who care about how do you express the faith in the modern world. And so I want to let people who are on the call, if you would like, turn on your microphone and ask Aidan. I will ask that the questions try to keep at this kind of seminar level, right? Why are we doing this? We'll put time aside at the end, a little bit about the how, right? How do you find out more about Aidan? Go to his website. How do you sign up for one of his classes? Why don't we leave some of those how-to questions maybe for the end? But for those of you who want to jump in with the discussion about why are we doing this and why does this matter? So I see we have Fred, and also please introduce yourself. I see Fred Hayward from Grand Rapids, a great town. Fred, please jump in.
Thank you. I'm used to doing this in board meetings all the time. We always have to raise our hands. So I'm grateful to be here. As you know, as you maybe see in the chat, I'm a Pontifex/TOB student. I'm one of those people that take liturgical art into the jail locally here in Grand Rapids. So a few times a month. It used to be more, but COVID's still suppressing that. So when I take icon and my guitar into the jail with my diocese to deliver either Holy Communion, if we could, we're just doing a communion service right now, or to do a Bible study from a Catholic perspective. Aidan, I cannot express how much this electrifies the 1 hour I have with those gentlemen. It just, you can't even, unless you see it, you don't even know. Before I did icons, it was one thing. Now I take icons from mostly Eastern tradition because I came from the Orthodox tradition originally. So I guess my question is, I can't be the only one doing that. These people are starving for beauty, absolutely starving. And it opens them up. I mean, it's just, they want to know, because every icon has probably 30 scriptural references, right? And so they preach well, even while I'm going through the service, the communion service. They say, well, what's this one about, the Orthodox resurrection or the transfiguration? They look at that, they want to know about it. And it just preaches, it just opens so nicely. So it is liturgical because it is in the form, at least when we're doing the communion service, that's liturgical, even though I'm a Eucharistic minister, external Eucharist, whatever. I get that we allow that in the West. So it's liturgical, but it isn't in the setting that no one normally thinks of it. I guess, what is your experience with using icons in extreme situations like that? I mean, is there room for this? What is your response to that, Aidan? Thank you.
Thank you. It's my first encounter with icons was actually at an art gallery in New Zealand. So they're outside the normal liturgical context, and though icons are made for worship, I think that they're greater than worship as well. They have a missionary role, if you like, and they like to come to the world. So I think I like that vision of Ezekiel, where he is shown the temple, and from underneath the threshold of the temple runs the river. Wherever that river goes, it brings life. So liturgical art can't be limited just to the walls of the church. Sometimes I'm asked to give lectures in nearly secular institutions, like I was involved in illustrating the St. John's Bible, and on that basis was asked to give a talk at the British Library, incredibly secular institution. I was in in Auckland recently in New Zealand, overlapping with an exhibition of icons there. So I was asked to give a lecture at this secular art gallery, and then at the art school, which is really secular. But people's response is amazing, and I think beauty can bypass a lot of people's misconceptions about what life with God is like. I think because beauty, a bit like fragrance, you smell something and immediately it evokes. It might be a perfume that a previous girlfriend used to wear. Immediately she's before your eyes. So I think beauty has that means of going directly to the nous, to the heart, bypassing our mental preconceptions. I think a lot of people reject God because they have a caricature of God. So often when people say, I don't believe in God, I ask them, what God don't you believe in? And I say, actually, I don't believe in that God either. I'm an atheist as well, if that's what God is like. So beauty is, whatever context it is, playing the guitar in a museum, in a prison, wherever, if it's a genuine, humble beauty, it goes straight to the heart. I remember after I'd frescoed this chapel where I was a hermit, someone's just come into my studio. I think you're going to come tomorrow. I've got the days wrong. Can you come tomorrow morning? That'd be good. I'm really sorry. I thought you're coming tomorrow. Sorry about that. Misunderstanding with actually, she's a leading scholar, Michelle Brown, one of the leading scholars in illuminated manuscripts in the world. I thought she's going to come tomorrow, but got our days wrong.
Bring her on to say hi and tell her.
This is a bit too late. Yeah, so I don't know that answers your question, but I think beauty has that capacity to bypass misconceptions, and if you can make that association, you have a beauty, that's actually God that's touching your soul. That's this shadow of God which has touched your soul. And actually, yeah. So that God I didn't believe in, perhaps he doesn't exist, but this God whose shadow I've seen, yeah, I could believe in him.
Great. We have some more questions coming in from Allison and Aidan, but I will also just say thank you so much for that question. I got interested in beauty through my work really on people who had suffered trauma, whether that be mental illness of some kind, chronic problems, drug addiction, sexual abuse. And I kept hearing stories of people who were opened up to an experience of transcendence through something beautiful, whether that was in nature or liturgical art, something that just touched them and told them that despite what they had suffered, there was something bigger and better and more beautiful. And most importantly, it was outside of them, but communicating to them somehow. So it's that, what I think I heard Aidan saying, we have this strong intuition that there is this being outside of us that can touch us. And when you present people with liturgical art, as you said so beautifully, it opens them. It opens them to this, which is already happening, but it gives them then a vision to hold on to about who is that God that's trying to touch them. And the place of liturgical art is to show them what's the message. And it's a message of hope, and it's a message of love. So thank you, Fred, for the work you're doing there in the prisons in Grand Rapids. I'm delighted to hear about that. Now, how about Allison, who's joining us from Nashville? Allison, please say hello, introduce yourself, and please ask the question.
Hi, I'm Allison, and yes, I live just south of Nashville, and I am a homeschooling mom who just has a lot of interest in educating my children in a classical way, and so beauty has always been a big part of our discussions. But I was wondering if Aidan could talk a little bit about contrasting sort of the contemporary scene on the obsession with images and the obsession with beauty, but it's in a very narcissistic way. So you talked about humility, and iconography and liturgical art has as its root humility, but social media and all of that we all live in or try to avoid, like me, is so narcissistic and so unhinged from reality, and I think just denies the incarnation of who we actually are, like Margarita was saying, these unified body, soul, and spirit. So I just think that if you would talk to the common person, they would say, oh, what do you mean we are not interested in images and beauty? Because that's all they're interested in, and to the exclusion of any sort of intellectual pursuit on the same path. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Yes. Really, really good question, Alison. the word beauty, one of the words for beauty in Greek, kalos, seems to be etymologically related to the word kalin, which means to call. So true beauty calls us, as I said earlier, toward beauty in self. False beauty sort of titillates you, gives you a feeling temporarily, but then leaves you completely empty. There's a certain sort of orchestral music, which I find a bit uncomfortable because it plays with my emotions. It sort of picks me up and it drops me down. So it's purely emotional, and it can give you a temporary feeling. And most modern imagery set advertising is very cunningly devised. It wants to create all sorts of associations to help you buy something. So it plays with you. Whereas true beauty challenges you and then leaves space for you to say, I'm giving you a taste now of what is good. Now you've got to take a step and become beautiful. So there's often a connection in true beauty between, how shall I call it? Not the ugly, but the grotesque in beauty. There's always an element of unbeauty in true beauty. This is a typical thing to describe. Say an icon of St. John the Baptist. It won't make him look particularly attractive always. He might have really skinny arms. He's got disheveled hair. So you realize actually to become beauty, these struggle involved. And the false beauty of today is all sort of, there's a perfect perfection to it. Whereas true beauty, there's an imperfection to it. You know what I mean? You noticed in most modern churches, everything's at right angles, everything's smooth and crisp and finished. Whereas older churches I've seen, there's an imperfection. The walls are a little bit bumpy. If you look at the floor plan of most medieval churches, they're often at right angles. So yeah, I think there's something unattainable about this beauty and this imagery that's presented to us. A lot of children, I know a lot of teenagers suffer from anorexia or some form of eating disorder because they're told that beauty is to become like this model rather than to become beauty in your spirit. So yeah, this term beauty is really quite problematical. True beauty calls you, Kalin calls you, false beauty creates a feeling that leaves you vacant at the end. So there's always something empty. So you need more of it. So it's addictive. You need more and more of it to have that temporary high, if you like.
Aidan, I want to get Adam's question here too, but I want to stay on this point for just a moment because Allison, thank you. You phrased that question so beautifully. And I did put a link in the chat box to your blog, which I greatly admire. But also, Aidan, you said some things that were extremely profound, and I do not want to miss them. So I think they're worth repeating and maybe just drawing out. And also, Allison, if you want to jump in with a follow-up question or clarification, let me know. But what I heard you say, Aidan, was that, Allison's question was, look, young people are all about images, right? They're all day on Instagram and TikTok and, Pinterest and more stuff than I can keep track of. What I heard you saying was that a lot of what is happening on social media is a kind of beauty, first of all, of appearances and a kind of a perfection. And I heard you say that kind of perfect beauty on images and Instagram is actually false, precisely because it's trying to be perfect, and that true beauty has a sense of incompleteness that's pointing to something outside of itself, that's leading us somewhere, right? So there's a difference between, and then you also said, I think, that false beauty might actually really work on our senses. Like it turns our heads, it gets us to click, it gets us to buy something, it gets us to think, oh, I want to look like that lady, I want to lose weight and buy her dress and whatever. But that later on, you're not satisfied by that false beauty. Even if you wanted it in the moment, it kind of leaves you kind of ick, right? Whereas true beauty, because it's open, because it opens you, it's like a good novel, or it's like a beautiful sunset. It's moved you. and you're still in this movement. So it's piercing you, it's opening you, it's wounding you, it's moving you. It's not giving you a false sense of perfection or completeness. That's an illusion, and the illusion deepens the void. Is that a good summary of what you said?
And Margarita, can I just give like a paradox? I loved everything you said. So just my own little follow-up would be, my mind immediately went to this, what I always tell my kids, speaking of which, my kids are going to be coming out from their Spanish class, so sorry if that's loud, but is like the idea of creation versus consumption. So modern social imagery in Instagram and all that wants you to consume things. So take in, take in, take in. But if true beauty calls you out, you should be drawn to create things. Hang on. Sorry. I'm a homeschooling mom and they're all chattering. So, but creation versus consumption. So if true beauty calls you to be like a sub-creator, that the impulse is radically different between consumption versus being called out to create.
Yes, entirely. And I'd say not just create, but operate in a priestly way. I haven't talked about transfiguration yet. That's my favorite subject, because it's interesting that Christ's garment, as well as his face, is transfigured. And his garment was made by people. It wasn't just raw linen. Someone gathered linen, spun it, made a garment, and then it became a participant in glory. So creating not just for the own sake, but I think God created us to turn wilderness into a garden. In other words, it's a synergy between us and the raw materials, if you like, that God gave to us. I have here in front of me a bit of lapis lazuli. So grind it up and then make it into a pigment, and then hopefully lift that rock into something higher by including it in an icon. So as you say, our task is to be creative, but creative to make creation more articulate in the praise of God. So creation isn't just to make us happy people, to give us satisfaction, I made something, though that does happen. It's actually to make the whole of creation, animate and inanimate, more articulate in the praise of God. So the Eucharist isn't just what we do on a Sunday morning. The Eucharist is cooking a meal, giving hospitality, painting, carving, giving water to the thirsty, etc. So our relationship with matter is just part of this, what I call the cosmic Eucharist. We become the mouthpiece of creation. Going back to the sort of the imperfection of true beauty, it's interesting that in written theology, the church fathers were keen to unsay as much as there were to say. They say God is love, but God is beyond the love of our human conception. When we say God is infinite, we're not saying that he's an eternal extension of a railway line. That all we can say about God is that he's not finite. We can't really define what infinity is in God. Or we can say that God's infiniteness is just not limited. So the fathers were as interested in what's called apophatic theology as cataphatic. Cataphatic means God descends to limitation. So we can say God is love. But then we've got to also say, well, we don't really know what God's love is in its fullness. We get a taste of it. So we should unsay as much as we say. And I think true beauty has that capacity to leave an openness. It gives us a taste that says we've got to the living God to be really satisfied. And I think consumerism only succeeds because it keeps us unsatisfied. It says, buy this, we buy it, we eat it, we clothe ourselves in it, we put that makeup on. If we were satisfied, then we wouldn't buy anything more. It's got to keep us in a continuous state of dissatisfaction so we consume more and more.
Thank you, Aidan, and thank you for that follow-up, Allison. That was beautifully put. All right, let's hear from Adam. Please introduce yourself, tell us where you're coming from, and go ahead with your question for Aidan.
Thank you so much, Margarita, and thank you for organizing this. And Aidan, thank you so much for speaking with us and having this conversation. I'm Adam. I'm a Lutheran pastor in Northern New Jersey, and I'm also a spiritual director. And my question actually dovetails with Allison so perfectly, I think, because I also want to ask about ugliness, but the ugliness of he who died on the cross, the ugliness of he who was not comely, who had no form. Recently, I was blessed to see that graffito on Palatine Hill of the crucified ass. It's pretty famous. The ass is on the cross. It's a man with the head of an ass, and it says something like, "This is the God of our," I forget the man's name, but it's this piece of anti-Christian graffiti. And then fast forwarding hundreds and hundreds of years, and you think of the Eisenheim altarpiece, or you think of Graham Sutherland's crucified Christ, who's this twisted mass of bloody flesh. It's a different sort of ugliness than the false beauty and the ugliness that the modern world delights in. It's the ugliness of the suffering servant of Isaiah. It's the ugliness of the crucifixion. With iconography today, and with the tradition of iconography that you're practicing, what is the place of the ugly, deformed slave of Christ dying on the cross?
That's it. Thank you very much, Madam, for your question. In my recent book, 2022, this year it's published, called Festal Icons, I look at the development of each of the festal icons. And it's very interesting looking at the development of the crucifixion. It took about 8 centuries to sort of come with the final formula, as it were, that we have. So initially, the early churches wouldn't depict the crucifixion whatsoever. They would only indicate the results of the resurrection. Then when they did start showing Christ crucified, it was Christ alive, as Rex Christus. And then later on, eventually, his eyes were closed. And then eventually him sort of more hanging like that. But interestingly, when they showed him definitely dead, they showed him as the sleeping Adam. So though he was dead, it was more the sleep of Adam to create Eve. And instead of Jesus, King of the Jews, they had Jesus, the King of Glory, and he wasn't slumped like that, a defeated man. His arms were more horizontal, embracing death. So what they did was, and this goes hand in hand with the liturgical text, they'll come up with paradoxes. You know, the King of Glory is crucified, or he sustains all things. He who sustains all things is nailed to a cross. I just think that Christ is God, but he never ceased to be God while he was on the cross. He never ceased to be God. He was keeping in existence the very people who are nailing him to the cross. So good liturgical art never separates Christ's humanity from his divinity. It's always both and. You just have a Grunwald, twisted, tortured human being, might be true to the humanity, but not to the divinity. The church ended up not just settling on the living Christ on the cross. It ended up uniting his suffering with his divinity. So you've always got to set, in art, we're always limited what we can do. So you always have some indication of Christ's suffering. So his eyes are closed, his head's down, he has a bit of hair dangling down. He's on a cross, he's nailed to it, so obviously he's dead. How do you indicate his divinity? So in his halo, you might have the words O on, the existing one, Jehovah, so he's God. He's not slumped. The various different ways of indicating his divinity as well as his suffering. So liturgical art always keeps 2 opposites together. So that's how the Orthodox iconography has dealt with it. But we should always remember that visual liturgical art in the church is never separated from the word. So one can't look at the crucifixion icon apart from the words, which they, in the Orthodox Church, we have lamentation, a really long service, lamentations, and it really does lay heavily the suffering of Christ and the torment of, especially the Mother of God, seeing her own Son upon the cross. So this is brought together with hymns that talk about this man on the cross is also God, and he's going to rise again. So I think the danger happens when you separate one from the other.
Thank you. That was a great answer. We are coming down towards the end of this. I want to be mindful of Aidan's time. He is in the UK. Mindful of all of you who are taking a break from lunch or homeschooling or whatever. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of the questions that were popping up in the chat box, but I will just echo a few of them because I do think they came up, and then I'll make a couple of practical suggestions where to go from here. So one of the questions was just, I think, following on discussion we were having with Allison about false beauty and true beauty, and whether or not rather than false beauty, we just might want to call something kitsch. I'm a big fan of the work of Roger Scruton, and he certainly uses that word, kitsch. And so I would definitely direct people in that direction, but whatever you call it, the idea that not all that passes as beauty is true beauty, I do think is important. So thank you for making that point, Aidan. And the other point I wanted to highlight that was coming up in the chat box from Verda Jaroszewski, that, you know, do we really live in a time where the culture has become so secular that people don't even hear about something transcendent and end up kind of worshiping themselves? And I think that's a very true comment, Verda. And I think, as we heard from Fred in Michigan, when you present people with true beauty, something that uplifts them, it immediately pierces through that and it generates a desire for that transcendence. So I think that's why I'm so drawn to Aidan's art and to his writing, because you say in your book, Beauty, Spirit, Matter, that in a world where people have lost a vocabulary for God, they still can experience God through some of this art that pierces right to the heart. So for people like Allison, who are homeschooling, for many of you whose names I recognize on this call, including my own mother and my aunt who have joined us today, who are doing important work in catechism and raising grandchildren, to those of you who are working in classical education, to those of you who are promoting this vision, there is an urgent need to support artists like Aidan, who are trying to bring back the fullness of the tradition of art and its meaning for the human person and for our understanding of God. So